It's 12:15 Eastern time, which means, as far as I know, it's time to get started. I put the title slide up so that everyone can make sure that they are in the correct place. This is a quick 30-minute session on owning your own data. We're going to talk about security, flexibility, and speed as part of that. I'm Ken Rickard. I am the Senior Director of Consulting at Drupal firm Palantir.net. As you can see, I went through to try to list or get some sense of how long I've been working with Drupal. This is just a list of DrupalCons that I've attended. And so you can get that sense. I've been working with Drupal since the 4.5 days and launched my first site in 4.6. A little bit about Palantir. So we are a US-based company. We were founded in 1996. Our headquarters are in Evanston, Illinois. You get bonus points if you know that's where Northwestern University is. We're a 35-person remote team distributed across 15 states in the District of Columbia. That's actually about to make 16 states because one of our people is moving. And we're a certified woman-owned small business. What do? We design and develop solutions using open source technologies and Agile methodologies. You can see on the screen some of our clients. There are other clients that we cannot list. And it's interesting for this talk because we specialize in working in higher education, healthcare, tech, and the public sector. Data security and just data management is a huge issue for most of our clients. One of the clients you'll see on this slide that you might not recognize by name is ETF. That's the Wisconsin Department of Employee Trust Funds. They handle the pension plan for the entire state of Wisconsin, which is the 9th largest pension in the United States. They touch 1 out of every 3 people in the entire state. And so their data issues are pretty massive. Again, just to give you a little bit about Palantir, we do projects from all different angles. If you need help with planning, if you need help with implementation, if you need help coming up with what the strategy should be, we handle that. We also do ongoing strategy and support, which is kind of a fascinating piece. And again, we can help you out with any of these 4 major elements of your project. We do a lot of ongoing maintenance for folks, and we do a lot of ongoing feature development with teams. So it's pretty exciting. And I will also point out, because I'm in charge of this, we're hiring a web development engineer. That position is, applications are open until Monday. There's a link right there. We can put it in the chat later where you can come by our expo booth and we'll be happy to talk to you about it. And for those of you who just went to the session on improving, reducing bias in your hiring process, we're trying to do that as well. And it's a really interesting thing. So we're going to be having a webinar next week where we talk about the position and what it's like to work at Palantir. So I encourage you to apply. We're looking for people with PHP, Drupal, and or JavaScript experience. So please. All right. All that out of the way, let's talk about owning your data and what that's going to mean. Really, we're going to talk about a couple of different things today. Again, the title was about security, flexibility, and speed. And I want to start by putting some sort of bedrock baselines down, which is what are we really talking about? We're, for the most part, people at DrupalCon are open source users and open source advocates. But again, it's important to make sure that we know what we're talking about. So one of the primary things that we all care about is data freedom. And that would go to a version of the rights of ownership and the rights of usage that go with free software, with open source software. So I would say there are 3 fundamental rights around data. Again, the right to create, view, edit, archive, and delete your data, the right to modify your data structure, and the right to move your data to a new system. And different pieces of open source technology and proprietary technology handle these in different ways. It's kind of interesting. We do some work with Salesforce, the company. They give you the right to modify your data structure. That is a core feature of their proprietary product. It's a very strong feature. If you want to move your data out, that's going to be a little bit more challenging. But again, I don't want to assume that because you're not open source, you don't get granted these rights. But they are things that you need to be looking for. In particular, that third one, that right to move your data to a new system, is fundamental to any modern web development project. And we'll talk about why that is in a bit. I also want to talk a little bit seriously about responsibilities of ownership. They love to say that open source software is free, and there's lots of ways you might state that. Free as in cookies, free as in whatever. I'm going with free as in puppies, and we were talking about this in a company chat this morning. If you've never had a puppy, they're much more responsibility than you might think. And so I do want to be serious here and say that the security, accuracy, and governance of your data is your direct responsibility. And it's an ongoing thing. And we'll talk about this when we talk about security. And I will also point out that these liabilities and responsibilities are also true if you're hiring out storage of your data to a third party. And I'll get back to that in a second. So here's a lighthearted slide. I talked about puppies. What do I mean? For those of you who are not dog owners, this is Mina. She just walked into my office. Mina is 15. We adopted her after we found her as a stray 15 years ago. And in that time, she has become part of the family. She has also developed an enlarged heart. So she's on special medication that she gets twice a day. And she has recently developed cataracts. So she's going blind in at least one eye. So she's not real difficult. She's only 30 pounds. But there is a lot going on in maintaining the quality of life for this dog. So I think that's always true. So when we talk about data rights, we have to talk about data responsibilities. And this is my reminder of that. And this is her lovely holiday photo. And she has fun wearing antlers. So we're going to start with the serious part, with security. So when we talk about data responsibility, as I mentioned, we do an awful lot of work with healthcare clients. And one of the big things that healthcare clients need to do is connect patients to physicians. The simple version of that is up in the right-hand corner of this screenshot. Appointments. Appointment data are one of those things that seem very, very innocuous, but are in fact really critical to the functioning of data security, because in the United States, at least, the regulations around what is considered personally protected medical information may include the information you need to submit in order to make an appointment with a new physician, right? The fact that I have to disclose certain things about my medical condition, even the type of doctor whose appointment I am recommending or I'm asking for, reveals something about my health status. That is protected and privileged information that we have to be very, very careful with. So what I want to say is you have to understand there's sort of three parts to security when we look at that. And as I mentioned, you're responsible for this stuff. So you have to be aware of what are the data privacy issues involved with the data that you store. The GDPR over in Europe is a big deal. Here, the big ones for us in the United States have to do with student data. They have to do with the data collected for people who are underage, who are minors, and they have to do with health data. Those things, your users have rights to how that data is stored and used, and you are responsible for protecting those. Data security is the second responsibility here. Breaches and hacks of your data are your liability. That again includes if you've outsourced the hosting and things to other companies. I did put an asterisk on this, however, because if you outsource to another company that's responsible for data that hosts your website or hosts your web infrastructure, they generally will have contractual language that provides guarantees against your liability. But it's something you have to be very, very aware of because you're still ultimately responsible. And then the third piece that I think a lot of people frequently overlook is data integrity. And data integrity has to do, I think, very directly with that appointment question. Okay, I want to make an appointment. How much information am I asking for in order to make that appointment? And here's where I would say the key is you only should store the data that has to be stored. And the converse to that, or the follow-on to that, is you only change what data has to be changed. And I'll give you another good example of the kind of thing that always makes me a little nervous. Lucky me, I'm about to get my second Pfizer vaccination on Saturday. But when I signed up for that, the hospital asked for my Social Security number. Again, for those of you not in the United States, a Social Security number is a personally identifying 9-digit number. I can't even remember. 9-digit number that they assign to you when you become a citizen. And it's the core of all identity theft. So anytime someone asks me for my Social Security number, I will say no, unless I have no choice. And in the case of getting a vaccine, which is really important, I have to do that. And so when we, as software engineers or as project managers or as product managers, when we talk to people about data security, one of your earliest prongs is simply identifying what is required. And if you need a unique identifier for people, how can you do that in a way that doesn't compromise their data privacy and create bigger problems for you down the road? So that's the big thing about the sort of warnings about security. And then I'll say security is really an ongoing strategy. It's not something you do once and then forget. There are multiple pieces to it. There's your technical infrastructure. There's different levels of compliance for hosting. If you're running e-commerce, there's all kinds of testing that has to be done to do what they call, again, in the States, PCI compliant hosting. There's FedRAMP compliant hosting for federal government work. There's data encryption, both during transit and at rest. And so these are big issues about how you handle them. Again, I'm not going to tell you how to solve them in this 30 minutes, but I'm going to highlight them as things that are very important for you to address. There are software best practices. One of the advantages that people overlook to having open source software is that, ironically, it's more secure than proprietary software because more people can look at the code. And that includes bad actors. And so it's actually easier to find insecure code. There are coding tools, and you'll see reference to them throughout this DrupalCon, that will help you audit your own code and look for insecure elements. I just did a review of a site the other day for someone, and they're handling medical practice stuff, and they wrote some custom code that's not secure. So it becomes really, really important that you understand the secure code guidelines that go into, say, Drupal development or anything that you're working with. Then it's a good question to ask of your vendors, like, what's their code security policy? How does that work? You also have to do periodic audits. It's not enough to say, well, it's secure when we launched. Go back once a quarter, go back however frequently you think is appropriate. And that's going to depend, again, on the level of data that you're collecting and the seriousness of the breach. And then the last piece, which I think is really important, is educating your team and understanding that the team who's working in your on your website, they come from marketing, they come from editorial, they come from technology teams. They have different understandings and different responsibilities. And they need to understand why certain decisions have to be made. So when we have that question of, hey, should I store this Social Security number? And I say, please no, let's not do that. They need to know why that's important. And that needs to be captured, that decision needs to be captured. And you need to be able to prevent backtracking on those kinds of decisions. So making sure your team understands the implications of their data, I think, is really, really crucial. Now we'll talk about the fun part. We'll talk about data agility. So again, we've got our sort of bedrocks down. We understand, I hope, a little bit more about what goes into your data strategy. We've talked about the security piece. Now let's talk about the fun parts. It's a really obvious example. Again, we have lots of medical clients. COVID came in, it disrupted everything, and all of our clients, not all, 90% of our clients had to do some form of pivot in terms of how they're presenting information, what additional information they're presenting, what kind of data they need. And having open control active control of your data sources makes these kinds of pivots much, much easier. So one of the great things about owning your data is they have both intended and accidental or unintended benefits. If you're doing customer-centric design, where the purpose of your website is to help people accomplish tasks, the only way you can do customer-centric design is to be able to change your data presentation and your data model to map to what people are actually doing. So that's a huge benefit that you might not be considering. Also note that preparing in advance for these kinds of changes give you a very, very specific competitive advantage because you can pivot more quickly than others in your space. And then I would also point out that flexible data structures are a risk mitigation strategy. For those of you in the project management field, I'm a big risk mitigation fan because I don't like it when things go badly. And so I want to make sure that I can pivot when I need to. And flexible data is a really good way to handle that. I will give you a non-medical example that is pretty key. Now, I'm not going to tell you which university this was. However, they do a lot of work with international students. And as soon as COVID hit, their international students could no longer come to the United States. So they had to move all of their courses online. Now, that is a huge undertaking. Their website presents all the course options and the formats and things like that. And it had just so happened that 6 months prior, we had finished an engagement with them to optimize their data flexibility. And I'll show you some more examples about that later. So they were able to make a very, very fast pivot when their business situation changed. And I think this is the sort of key point to any form of open data storage, right? Being able to do what you need to with what you have. So we're going to talk about that some in the next bit. The last piece that I want to say, and I hinted at this when we were talking about security, is that data governance is a big deal, right? Data is just an aggregate of information about people, and data is managed by the people on your team, right? So some of the problems that you'll run into is if you have data in multiple places, and that university website I just showed you has that problem because their data is stored in a course management system and then pulled into Drupal. So now they've got duplicates, and they have the possibility of what happens if our data gets out of sync, what happens if data from one system doesn't get to the other system. All right. So that's an interesting problem. But you could also have multiple owners and stakeholders regarding your data, and it could be hard to make decisions, especially if you don't have the proper perspective. Without giving away too much, I'm working on something right now where I'm having to have pretty difficult conversations with a client whose data model does not support their design. This is something you always want to get out in front of earlier. And so the question now becomes, do we alter the design, or do we invest in making pretty substantial changes to the data model? And again, I'll get into that when we talk about speed. The key to all of this, to governance, is agility in your team. Again, having technical agility is not good enough. You have to be able to have these conversations in order to push things forward. So I said I've been doing this for a long time. So I didn't do this project in 1972. I did this project in probably 2012. I think this might have been a Drupal 6 project or one of our first Drupal 7s. I was working with a state public radio system. They wanted to take their entire playlist from 1972 and put it online and make it searchable. And their internal team had 3 key stakeholders: their archivist, their DBA, who was an Oracle DBA, a database administrator, and their designer. Those 3 people had been working there for at least 30 years total and had never, ever had a conversation before. And the challenge, of course, is in order to complete the critical part to their project, those 3 people have to be in alignment, because we can't do what they're trying to do if those 3 don't have a shared understanding of how the data works and how it's going to be used. So, excuse me. I am checking time. I have 9 minutes, so I think we're right on schedule. We're going to talk some about performance. And I think this reflects some of the things we've been talking about so far. There are two kinds of speed that I think we want to talk about. There's web performance, there's site performance, and there's governance performance. There's decision-making performance. So there's the question of, can you access the data that you need in a reliable and efficient way? Can you agree to data model modifications in a reliable and efficient way? And then there are two other good questions that I would put that are both performance issues and governance issues, which is, do you know where your canonical data store lies? Like, which version is the truth? And then how do you reconcile derivatives of that truth? So that's a huge question. Again, we could spend another 20 minutes on, but I'm not going to today. But let's go back to our higher education example. The challenge to building a page like this from their course management system is that the data is stored in multiple different locations. And I believe, as you look, like this was their during the search view, and this is their viewing the page view. And there's a lot of information here. And the challenge is, and when you do this type of work, you get used to using a lot of spreadsheets. This is our map of where all that data comes from in their third-party system. Now, their third-party system couldn't, it could provide an API to let them build that page. The problem was, if you wanted to build the page with all the data that they wanted, they had to make 8 or 9 separate API calls. And every API call you make is expensive. So the big project that we had was to figure out how all of these things work, how they're stored, and how we can reprocess them so that we can produce this page efficiently. In their current site, this makes one API call directly to Drupal that delivers exactly the data that they want, because we consolidated all of these things, right? So when we talk about your application and speed, we're talking about streamlining the data model. How do you consolidate the requests that you're making? How do you cache that, right? And there are 3 fundamental ways that you might do that. If you're using Drupal, which most of us are, the Drupal database is a very efficient caching mechanism for external data and API data. You can also push things to file. It can be very, very efficient to take your data and put it to, flat file. That's perfectly appropriate. And you may be working with vendors who have strong APIs and strong caching. When you do that, however, the question becomes, well, how do I reset that cache to make sure that I have the freshest data? And that's one of the challenges that you'll run into. When on this website, they have to refresh the course data every hour because I didn't show you, but you can sign up for courses online, so they have to know if there's an open seat in that course, and that open seat data is stored in the course management system, not in Drupal. And I'll point out, to wrap back to the security piece, it's not stored in Drupal because it's an e-commerce transaction that we don't want to touch because we don't want to have to deal with the security concerns of storing credit card data, right? So they already have an existing third-party payment processing application that directly integrates to the course management system. There's no reason for us to reproduce that. But it does create a bit of a race condition where if somebody purchases a course, we now have one less available seat, and we have to make sure we get that update as quickly as we can. So you can see this gets really complicated really, really quickly. But I will also point out that there is a governance aspect to speed. The data model does solve some of these problems. But when you have data that lives in multiple places, as I said before, you can get duplicates, you can get inconsistencies. Frequently, especially with university clients, when they're pulling course data over into Drupal, they want to enhance that in some way. And so you have a derivative of the canonical data sitting in Drupal. And the question becomes, Do you push that back to the data store or not? So how do you deal with those duplicates? How do you deal with inconsistencies? But it can also be a huge challenge just to make data model changes, because multiple owners, as I pointed out with the radio example, multiple owners and stakeholders may have multiple views, and sometimes it can be complicated because you'll want to make a data model change and it'll make life really difficult for your editors, or your editors won't understand why that data model change is necessary. And people hate workflow changes, and so it can be very, very difficult. And as I said in another project, the data model may dictate that something in the design simply can't be done. And so when and how do you make those compromises as a team becomes really, really important. And as I said, you do a lot of this in spreadsheets. This is actually a spreadsheet from an online conference we did last week, that we did last year. This is literally just our data model negotiation document where the technical team and the editorial team tried to talk to each other and capture decisions. And the reason I point this out is not so that you can read it, but the things in green, red, and yellow on the left-hand side are new additions, and that those colors indicate the state of those additions, as in green, yes, it's fine; yellow, we have questions; red, we haven't done that yet. Do we need to do it? We should talk about this. So this is a very, very classic piece. And again, as part of your governance, you need to capture all of these decisions. So with a stunning 2 minutes left, I'll give you some best practices. So when you're owning your data, remember it's an ongoing process. You want to be able to identify your data sources. You want to know what's canonical storage and what's derivative storage. You want to know what your security paradigm for that is. You want to know what your data structure is, and you want to know what APIs you have access to. You do, and this is where a lot of places I think have challenges, you want to assign data ownership. Someone at your organization needs to be responsible for each data source. And trust me, one of our project managers is doing a session on Friday about this. Just having one data owner is not enough. You need a backup plan for contingencies. I'm working on a project right now where the principal is about to go away on maternity leave. I'm doing contingency work at our own company because one of our other employees is on paternity leave, right? So I had to pick up everything that they own. Actually, I'm covering for another person who's on sabbatical. So you have to be able to pass along responsibilities. You also do need to schedule audits and reviews. And that is a great place to bring in third parties to do that. And using your data, I would say, is also an ongoing process. So you want to know how you're using it. You want to know what the canonical and derivative uses are. This is especially true for people who publish once and use in multiple places. You need to document the time sensitivity for updates. And you need to document the data flows between systems. And then, pardon me, it's Georgia, it's allergy season down here. You need to assign editorial ownership as well, because it's not quite good enough that the technical people understand. It's important that editorial team knows how to identify problems and how to communicate problems in an effective manner. So thank you. We finished, I think, just on time. I don't believe we have official time for Q&A. However, Palantir.net does have a booth over in the expo hall, and I'm going to jump over there here in a minute, and we'll be around all week. I'm going to stop screen sharing for now and see if there are any questions that we do have time to answer. And hopefully I didn't talk too fast. And then I will drop in a link to the session I just mentioned. That is the session that Megan Davids, who's one of our product managers, is doing. Quite literally, just before the COVID restrictions hit the United States, we kicked off a project with a university client. It was actually the last airplane flight I took. And almost immediately, that team had to start planning for what happens if someone gets sick. And so it's a really nice tie into what we were talking about here today. Again, I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm going to shut this down, and I'm going to hop over to our expo booth. Thanks again.